Layne Staley was born on August 22nd, 1967 at Overlake Hospital in Bellevue, Washington. His parents, Phil and Nancy Staley, gave him the middle name Rutherford, which he hated. He would get totally pissed off if anybody called him that. However, Layne happened to be a huge fan of Tommy Lee from Motley Crue, so he changed his middle name to Thomas when he was a teenager.
Like, subscribe, thank you.
Layne loved music from the get-go. He started drumming at 12, but singing was his real dream. He was actually playing in little bands in his early childhood, and by 9, he had written his own All About Me book that he had wanted to be a singer. His parents loved Sabbath, Deep Purple, and lots of other stuff, so he grew up listening to a mix of hard rock, metal, and even some industrial and new wave bands at the time. He was also really into Prince and David Bowie. In 1984, Layne Staley joined a band called Sleaze, made up of kids from Shorewood High School. And this band would actually later become the first incarnation of Alice in Chains in '86. And this is where he started figuring out how to use his voice and become comfortable on stage. His buddy from Sleaze, Johnny Bucola, said that he had star qualities even though he was actually shy on stage. Johnny also said that you could really hear the grain and soul in his voice even back then. So Sleaze got going in 1984, and the original band members, all from Shorewood High School, were Johnny Bucolas on the guitar, Zoli Samonte also on the guitar, John Bergstrom on the drums, and Byron Hansen playing bass. They were in need of a vocalist. James Bergstrom had bumped into a friend, Ken Elmer, who happened to be in the school marching band. Elmer thought Layne should try out for the band. At the time, Layne was playing drums, but he had always expressed that he wanted to be a singer. So Staley was reluctant to try out for the band, but his stepbrother pushed him to it. They held the audition in their basement jam room, and the band was blown away by Staley's voice. He was a shy guy, but his voice had this unique, gritty quality, like it had a soul. The band's first jam session together, they jammed out Motley Crue's Looks That Kill, and they knew right away that Layne was a perfect vocalist. He was hitting all the notes. They were totally impressed with his range, his soulfulness, and that ability to really stretch out there. Sleaze went through a bunch of different members before calling it quits in '87. Zoli Samonte was the first to go, and Chris Markham took his place. When Markham and Hansen split, Jim Shepard took over on the bass. Around this time, Johnny Bucolas dipped out to play with another band, so Staley asked his buddy Nick Pollock to play guitar with him. Shepard had actually left to play with the band Sanctuary, and Mike Mitchell took over the bass duty. Bucolas would later rejoin. And Layne Staley and Bucola showed up on the Como 4 show town meeting in Seattle back in '85. They were protesting the PMRC, which was trying to censor rock music. Frank Zappa was on the show, railing against the PMRC. Staley got to talk during the program, and he went straight for Sally Nevius, one of the PMRC founders. Staley said the band's music wasn't offensive and that nobody had the right to judge their songs. So 1986 rolls around, Bucolas is back in the band, and boom, they decide to call themselves Alice in Chains. Bucolas had actually got the name from a chat with Russ Klatt, who is the singer for the band Slaughterhouse-5. Alice in Chains, like Sleaze, initially played glam metal, but also dabbled in heavier styles. Staley said the band used to dress in drag and play speed metal. They were basically a cover band, playing songs by Slayer and Armored Saint. The last time Alice in Chains played together with Layne Staley, Mike Starr, Jerry Cantrell, and Sean Kinney, was in '87 before they called it quits. Nevertheless, this lineup would split up, and everybody just went to do their own thing. Now, in 1987, Jerry Cantrell had met Layne at a Seattle party. And this is while Layne Staley was living and working at Music Bank rehearsal studios. Staley had put together this funk band called Layne Staley and the Black Holes, which needed a guitar player at the time. And the Black Holes were actually a pretty solid funk band, but they don't get talked about that much. His voice, all rough and rugged, fit right in with the old school funk music behind him. It's a real shame though, because most of their music was tyrannically copy-claimed out of existence.
'Cause there ain't nothing they can do tonight. So are you ready? Baby, don't put up a fight.
Nevertheless, that group got down and got funky. At this time, Jerry Cantrell was homeless. And Cantrell had said that he would join the band, but at the same time, Jerry Cantrell was also forming his own group, so he wanted Layne to sing with that band. And they didn't have a name yet, and they had Sean Kinney and Mike Starr. Layne wasn't really interested in joining this other group, but they really wanted him badly, so they came up with a plan. They started auditioning singers, and it was at the very place where Layne was working. And they picked some of the worst of the bunch, people who just literally could not sing. So of course one can imagine how that rehearsal studio was sounding. But eventually the straw that broke the camel's back was when they hired a male stripper to come in and try out for the vocal part. And that's when Layne was like, screw this, okay, I'm joining. And with that, the funk project ended, but that definitely wasn't the end of good things to come. So Jerry Cantrell's new band starts getting to work on their music, figuring out their sound and getting ready for their first show. And they ended up playing their first gig at the University of Washington. They managed to put together a 40-minute set, basically a bunch of covers as well as some originals, throwing in Hanoi Rocks and David Bowie for good measure. And the band names that they were throwing around were pretty interesting as well, including Fuck and Diamond Lie, which is the name of Cantrell's old band. But Layne really liked Alice in Chains, and so did the rest of the band, so he was able to secure permission from the old bandmates to use it. And so that's what they went by, the Seattle music scene. So during those early gigs, Roundy Hauser, a local promoter, saw Alice in Chains and decided to pay for some demos. They were going to actually record at the Music Bank in Washington, but then the cops raided the place. It was a huge pot bust, and apparently the biggest in the state's history. Nevertheless, they were able to finish a demo called the Treehouse Tapes, and it ended up in the hands of Kelly Curtis and Susan Silver, who were managing Soundgarden at the time. So they passed it along to Nick Terzo, who was the A&R guy at Columbia, who then got them a meeting with the label head, Don Linner. With his approval, Terzo went ahead and signed the band in 1989. So they then did another demo, and this ended up being leaked as a bootleg called Sweet Alice. It was a little more well-produced than the Treehouse Tapes, but the label went with an EP called We Die Young, and it came out on both vinyl and cassette, and it turned out to be a hot commodity because they didn't make a ton of copies of it. Later on, a rare CD with just the title track would come out as well. And it sounded like the popular metal bands at the time. Layne's vocal range was on full display, and the whole point of it was to get mainstream rock fans hooked. And both We Die Young and It Ain't Like That would also end up on their very first album, which would come out right after this. And for that, they quickly got to work with producer Dave Jordan to oversee the project. And the way that Jordan landed the gig was pretty interesting in and of itself. He told Jerry Cantrell that Metallica took Tony Iommi's sound and made it faster. And then he said, but you had slowed him down again. And that clinched the deal. Jerry said, absolutely, we will work with you. Sean Kinney, the drummer, claims he recorded the album with a broken hand, and he almost didn't even get to play on it, because they started rehearsing with Greg Gilmore from Mother Love Bone. But he spent a lot of time messing around with one hand, showing Greg how to do it. And Jordan had showed up, and they started trying to give it a try, and then he said, forget it, pull the plug. It just won't be the same. So they squeezed in a short break. The cast had stayed on for a while, but Sean really didn't want to miss the event, so he ditched the cast in the studio early and kept a bucket of ice next to the drums. They recorded Facelift in Seattle at London Bridge Studio, and then also a little bit of it in Hollywood at Capitol Studios from December of 89 to April of 90. Some of the footage from those sessions would end up on Music Bank, the video's DVD. And Cantrell said the album's moody aura came straight from the gloomy vibes of Seattle. And Jerry also said that the rhythm and groove of Man in the Box really helped Alice in Chains find their sound to become the band that they were meant to be. Now, what's interesting is that the producer, Dave Jordan, actually got the idea to use a voice box in the song while driving to the studio one day and listening to Livin' on a Prayer by Bon Jovi, which had come on the radio. Of course, this song was a far cry from Livin' on a Prayer in every other way. Man in the Box had a dark and menacing vibe. The talk box would sound more like how Slash used it to give it that slithering snake-like vibe to the song. And this is where many first-time listeners would really get an introduction to the voice of Layne Staley. Voice during the verses, to those signature raspy screams for the chorus. A Jekyll and Hyde somewhat reminiscent to what Axl Rose would do earlier. But Layne's voice was different. He was a straightforward singer. No bullshit. It never sounded forced, just natural. And the lyrics were dangerous at the time. The overall meaning of the song, railing against censorship, but a lot of the more hardcore religious folks were taken aback with lyrics like Jesus Christ, deny your maker. That just freaked people out. But it was rock and roll, and it was rebellion. Jerry kicks out a blazing wah solo that's bluesy as all hell and fits perfectly over the top of the groove. And this was a welcome change from a lot of the late 80s groups that were just going overboard with everything. You know, with this band, there was no makeup, no hair standing 5 feet up in the air with hairspray. They just played rock and roll with a rebellious edge. Another song that was really formative for the band was I Can't Remember. And the song It Ain't Like That actually started with a really cool guitar riff that Cantrell had actually messed up, but it turned out to be a cool mistake, so they left it. Love, Hate, Love was considered by many to be the album's masterpiece, where Layne Staley really dug deep for the vocals, and Jerry equally dug deep to pull a lot out of that guitar. And lyrically, We Die Young, which was also on the EP, was written after seeing a bunch of young kids dealing drugs on the bus to rehearsal. And then the song Bleed the Freak was written about fighting against the world and the people who put you down. It has a really cool dark melody, and Layne throws in some wicked sounding tones over the heavy parts. And Jerry Cantrell had actually written Sunshine as a tribute to his late mom, and they ended up dedicating the album to her after she passed away. The scream at the end of Real Thing was a shout out to Coming to America, the Eddie Murphy movie, where his character was in a band called Sexual Chocolate. But interesting that Facelift just kind of simmered. It didn't take off immediately. In the first year, the album sold about 40,000 copies, which is pretty low for a major label release. But back during those days, they had a concept called artist development, and so the band was able to just keep plugging away, touring and promoting, slowly building that fan base. But then out of nowhere, things changed when MTV started playing the video for Man in the Box during the regular daytime shows. And that's when music fans perked up and took a listen. And it ended up hitting number 18 on the mainstream rock charts. And then within 6 weeks of it hitting MTV and blowing up, it would sell 400,000 copies in the US alone. So on 9/11, 1991, the album officially went gold. And this actually made it the first grunge album to hit that mark. So Alice in Chains hit the road to ride the wave of their album's success, and those tours cemented their reputation as a killer live band. They'd open up for Iggy Pop, Van Halen, Poison, and Extreme, which helped their music reach even a wider audience. But they were having a hard time winning the crowds over still. Grunge was still a new thing, and they especially had a hard time when they joined the Clash of the Titans tour, playing alongside Megadeth, Anthrax, and Slayer. A lot of those metal audiences just were not having it at all. Nevertheless, they were still finding successes. In '92, Man in the Box actually got a Grammy nomination. But it would be Van Halen, who at the time had recorded For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, who would actually beat them out. Still though, not a bad start, all things considered. So after touring, Alice in Chains hit the studio to demo their next album, but wound up recording 5 acoustic songs instead. Sean Kinney, the drummer, had a dream about making this EP called Sap while he was in the studio. The band was a bit on the superstitious side, so they said, well, hey, if you had a premonition, let's record it. And this album dropped right when Nirvana's Nevermind was killing it on the Billboard charts. And that created a huge wave, which made Seattle bands way more popular and got everybody talking about this new grunge music. It took just about 2 weeks for Sap to go gold. And the EP kicks off with Brother, where Jerry Cantrell takes the lead vocals, and Ann Wilson from Heart shows up to sing with Layne and Jerry in the choruses of Brother and Am I Inside. They also got Chris Cornell to sing on the album, along with Mark Arm from Mudhoney, where they sang on Right Turn. And so, of course, in the album credits, it became a credit to Alice Mudgarden. And then Alice in Chains would show up in a Cameron Crowe movie called Singles in 1992, and they ended up playing a bar band. And they also wrote and recorded the song called Wood. Music video for the film soundtrack won Best Video from a film at the 1993 MTV Music Awards. And their next album, Dirt, released in 1992, would really show the band hitting a good stride musically. The group really dug deep while making this album. A lot of strong emotions involved. This would turn out to be the band's best-selling album, peaking at number 6 on the 200 chart. And since coming out, it has gone 5 times platinum. And the album's overall vibe was definitely dark and grungy. Jerry got a killer guitar tone on there, and Layne was really at the top of his game. Songs like Rooster, with that really haunting beginning, really showed off Layne's voice, with that signature rasp, all soulful at the top. And then when it starts hitting heavier, he just comes out swinging. Them Bones is a really simple arrangement, but it's much more hard rockin' all the way through. It also really shows off Jerry's guitar work. Down in a Hole turned out to be a really huge hit. It's a dark ballad and one of the most poignant songs the band wrote. And these songs stayed on the charts for almost 2 years. So the group ends up getting a gig as the opening act for Ozzy Osbourne's No More Tours. But right before the tour started, Layne had a bad ATV crash, so he had to use crutches on stage. After their January 22nd, 1993 gig in Rio at the Hollywood Rock concert, saying he wanted to spend more time with his family. But nevertheless, the plan was to keep the tour going strong and keep the media buzzing. But Starr would say that really what it was that he had gotten canned from the band due to his drug problem. But Layne was dealing with his own personal struggle. Alice in Chains was on tour, and their manager, Susan Silver, actually got bodyguards to keep Layne Staley away from drugs. But he still ended up relapsing during the tour. Mark Lanigan, the singer for the Screaming Trees, remembers going wild with Layne Staley. He said it was a crazy, messed up party fueled by drugs and alcohol, with them acting like teenagers, staying up for days straight. They pretty much tried anything they could get their hands on. But with Starr out, the band started looking for bass players, and they picked up Mike Inez, who was playing with Ozzy. They had actually made friends with him when they were touring along with Ozzy for his No More tours. So the band, while in Brazil, asked Inez to join them, to which he said yes. And Inez was all set to do the Brazil shows, even getting vaccinations. But it turned out that Starr really wanted to do the last 2 shows himself, so the band honored that. They told Inez to then meet them in London. As a result of the shots, though, Inez actually ended up getting sick for a few days. But they were able to get everything together, and Mike Inez played his first show with Alice in Chains on January 27, 1993 at the Camden Underworld in London. They also recorded 2 songs, What the Hell Have I and A Little Bitter, with Inez for the Last Action Hero soundtrack in April of 93. Now at this point, in the summer of 93, they would end up on their last big tour with Layne. After the tour ended, Layne Staley said that Alice in Chains just wanted to chill in the studio with their acoustic guitars and see what came out. And they weren't actually planning on releasing any of the music, but the label heard it and were pretty stoked, because this was basically just 4 dudes jamming in the studio making some music. And this became Jar of Flies, which was an all-out acoustic EP. And in just a week, it shot immediately to the top of the Billboard 200. Making it the first EP and first Alice in Chains record to do so. It also had their first song to hit number 1, No Excuses. I Stay Away also hit number 10 on the charts, and Don't Follow made it to number 25. Jar of Flies went triple platinum, selling over 2 million copies in the US its first year out. It also got 2 Grammy nominations in 95. But after Jar of Flies came out, Layne Staley checked into rehab in order to kick his heroin habit yet again. He had tried a bunch of different programs, but he just couldn't stay clean for long. And the rest of Alice in Chains, they would fly to LA every week for therapy sessions while Layne was in rehab. They're supposed to tour with Metallica, Danzig, and Fight the summer of 94, even playing Woodstock 94. But while they're getting ready, Staley was back on the horse again. So this forced the band to call off the tour just a day before it was actually supposed to start. After Alice in Chains canceled their tour with Metallica, James Hetfield mocked Layne Staley's heroin addiction by making motions with his arm, as if shooting up, a gesture that Lars and Kirk also imitated. Hetfield further taunted Staley by moaning, I can't tour, I can't tour. The crowd got pissed off, and they started throwing shoes at Hetfield in response to his gesture. According to one person who claims to have known James, Hetfield was a good person when sober, but could be a colossal asshole when under the influence. James Hetfield later admitted he didn't know Staley well, but was looking to provoke a reaction from him, as according to him, Layne Staley was known for being antisocial. Years later, after Staley passed away, Hetfield wrote a song about him, but he ultimately decided not to include it on Metallica's album, feeling the song wasn't good enough. Things would look up a little bit, though. The band ended up popping up on the soundtrack for the indie flick Clerks, where it climbed to number 7 on the rock charts. Now, when Cobain passed away in 94, it freaked Layne Staley out so bad that he actually got sober for a bit, even though he would fall right back into it. The management for Alice in Chains had to turn down a lot of big touring opportunities, keeping the band off the road and trying to help Layne Staley get clean. Candlebox actually stepped in for Alice in Chains on the tour. Sean Kinney had said in 96 that by that point, nobody could really trust each other. The band was just on the verge of losing it, and the public meltdown would be the last thing that they would have wanted. But in 95, while Alice in Chains were on their hiatus, Layne Staley joined Mad Season, which was a grunge supergroup featuring Mike McCready from Pearl Jam, John Baker Saunders from the Walkabouts, and Barrett Martin from the Screaming Trees. Pearl Jam's guitarist wanted to help Layne out by bringing him into this side project. He thought maybe playing with clean musicians might actually help him to be able to stay sober. Mad Season dropped one record called Above, where Layne sang and also had a hand in designing the album cover. And the album did not do too bad. Their single River of Deceit hit number 2 on the mainstream rock charts. The band itself actually has a pretty interesting history because the members had actually met in rehab. Mike McCready had actually met Saunders in Minneapolis while they were both in treatment for substance abuse. The album's second single, I Don't Know Anything, reached number 20 on the mainstream rock chart. And they ended up coming out with a concert film of a performance at Seattle's Moore Theater, Live at the Moore, which would be released on August of 95. The band also recorded a cover of I Don't Want to Be a Soldier by John Lennon for the 1995 tribute album Working Class Hero. And then in 1995, Mad Season went on hiatus so that all the band members could return to their original groups. But Mad Season would never perform live again, and they actually permanently disbanded in 99 when Sanders passed away. Tragically, he had relapsed and ended up dying of a drug overdose in 99. So after a 2.5-year hiatus, on April 10, 1996, Alice in Chains reconvened for the MTV Unplugged show, and their set list was a knockout, including songs like Wood, Rooster, Down in a Hole, Heaven Beside You, and they actually debuted a new song called Killer Is Me with Cantrell singing lead. But they had added another guitar player, Scott Olson, so now they were playing this as a 5-piece. They put out a live album in July of 96, which hit number 3 on the Billboard 200 and went platinum along with the home video. And they also showed up on Letterman in May 10th of 1996, playing Again and We Die Young. And then Alice in Chains would play their last ever gigs, warming up for Kiss for the 96-97 Alive Worldwide Tour. And they played 4 gigs. Layne's last ever live performance was on July 3rd of 1996 in Kansas City, Missouri. After the show, Layne was found unconscious following an overdose, and he was rushed to the hospital. So the band was forced on yet another hiatus. But by this time, a lot of fans were saying that Layne just was not looking healthy, basically hanging onto the microphone stand, which is a huge change from his usual energetic performances of years gone by. On October 29, 1996, Layne's ex-fiancée, Demery, passed away from a drug-related heart problem. And for this, they actually had to put Staley on a 24-hour watch. Her passing away really messed him up pretty bad. Word on the street at that time was that Layne was pretty much done after that. But still, on February 26th of 97, Layne and the rest of Alice in Chains went to the Grammys after Again got nominated for Best Hard Rock Performance. And that April, Staley bought a 3-bedroom condo in Seattle's University District. He had actually done it through a trust. But Toby Wright, the guy who produced Alice in Chains' third album, actually set up a home studio for the group there. And in 98, while rumors were swirling that Layne was practically a shut-in, had suffered gangrene, and was surviving on Ensure, but the band was hanging out there. And on June 22nd, 98, Layne Staley had actually called into Rockline while Jerry Cantrell was on there promoting his Boggy Depot solo album. And he just reached out to tell him how much he loved the album and give him his support. And in October of 98, Layne would hit the studio again with Alice in Chains to record Get Born Again and Died. Both of the tracks turned out solid, and they really did a great job with layering Layne's voice. But these would ultimately be the last ones he did. The songs ended up on Music Bank box set, which came out in 99, but still rumors of Staley's health kept popping up, even while the meetings were going on. The band had originally picked Dave Jordan, who was their first producer, and David said that Staley was 80 pounds and looked pale as a ghost by this time. The studio engineer, Elon Trujillo, said that Layne did not look like his old self, and that Layne had lost all of his teeth by this time and his legs had atrophied. But for his absolute last public appearance, Layne Staley showed up at a Jerry Cantrell solo gig in Seattle on Halloween of 1998. Cantrell had actually invited him up to come on stage, but Layne turned down the opportunity. And the last public photos that he had taken were actually backstage at that very event. After that show, Staley popped back into the music scene for a short bit in November of 98 to lay down some vocals for the supergroup Class of 99. That group was made up of members from Rage and Gene's Addiction. Layne ended up becoming a recluse in the Seattle condo, where he just basically withdrew from society. Friends said that he was mainly making art, playing video games, and trying to fight his drug problem the best he could. People who knew him well said he basically lived in his own world during that time. And Layne's mom, Nancy, said that even though he was pretty much a recluse in his last few years, his family and friends were still there for him. People flooded his phone and mail with messages and letters hoping to keep in touch. She had said that just because he was isolated didn't necessarily mean that he didn't have a few good times during that period. And she saw Layne Staley on Thanksgiving in 2001, and also on Valentine's Day in 2002 when he visited his sister's newborn. That would be the last time she ever saw her son. Sean Kinney looked back on those tough years, noting how Staley shut himself off from the world, both physically and emotionally. He said he tried getting in touch with Layne, calling him all the time, even shouting up at his place, but Staley never answered. Kinney was a bit angered, saying that even if someone broke in, Staley wouldn't open his door. He had actually seriously considered breaking in himself, but figured that if Staley did not want the help, there's nothing else he could do. And Matt Fox, who was a close friend of Layne's, said it wasn't unusual for him to go weeks without contacting anybody. Staley's friends and bandmates tried to urge him to go to rehab, but he just wouldn't listen, pushing them away and basically just making it harder for himself. Layne Staley's accountants reached out to his ex-manager, Susan Silver, on April 19th, 2002, and they were worried because he hadn't touched his bank account in 2 weeks. So it was definitely a mark of odd behavior, because other than that, he was always withdrawing from it. And so Silver got in touch with his mom, Nancy. Nancy became really worried, and she called 911, saying she hadn't heard from her son in a few weeks. So the cops took her up to Staley's place, and that's where they found the body. Staley was 6 feet tall, but he weighed just 86 pounds when he died. And by that time, 2 weeks had gone by, so there was full-on decomposition. They actually had to use dental records in order to identify him. He had a big pile of mail by his door, and his cat, Sadie, normally a really quiet cat, was meowing like crazy when they showed up. The autopsy showed that Layne Staley died from a mix of heroin and cocaine, which is a speedball. They had found him 2 weeks after, so that puts the date of his passing at April 5th, 2002, which would be the same day that Kurt Cobain died 8 years earlier. Layne's death was ruled accidental, and Nancy's story was that ex-Alice in Chains bass player Mike Starr was actually the last one to see him alive. Starr hung out with him the day before he passed away on April 4th, which was also Mike's birthday. And he remembered that Staley was seriously sick and wouldn't call for help. They got into an argument, and Mike Starr just stormed out of the place. But Layne Staley was yelling after him, "Not like this. Don't leave me like this." Starr later said that he was really sorry for not calling 911, explaining that Staley had said that he would stop being his friend if he did. Starr was on benzos that night, which totally messed his head up, but he apologized profusely to Layne's mom for not calling. But she made it clear that neither she nor the rest of the Staley family blamed him at all. She told Starr that Layne himself would forgive him. He would say, "Hey, I did this, not you." But even though she told him otherwise, Starr kept blaming himself for what went down. He kept it to himself until he talked about it on Celebrity Rehab in February 2010. And so on April 20th, 2002, a bunch of people, over 100 fans and friends, showed up at the Seattle Center to remember Layne. Also present were his bandmates, Jerry Cantrell, Mike Starr, Mike Inez, and Sean Kinney, as well as Chris Cornell. Staley was cremated, and they had a private memorial service for him on April 28, 2002, on Bainbridge Island in Washington's Puget Sound. Staley's family and close friends showed up for the private memorial alongside his Alice in Chains bandmates, as well as manager Susan Silver and Chris Cornell, plus a bunch of other people from the music industry. Cornell, joined by Hart's Ann and Nancy Wilson, sang Wild Horses by the Rolling Stones and Sand by the Lovemongers at the service. After Layne died, Jerry Cantrell put out a solo album called Degradation Trip 2 months later and dedicated it to him. And Jerry Cantrell also took Layne Staley's cat, Sadie, and looked after her until she passed away in 2010 at 18 years old. Layne was a badass singer. His voice was haunting, and he poured his soul and energy into every song. His voice, raw and full of emotion, really captured the pain and vulnerability of the grunge scene, making him a big name in that whole movement. Staley's voice, whether it was the pain screams and Man in the Box, or the more contemplated vibe and Down in a Hole, or the dark self-reflection in Nutshell, was always unique, getting across a raw emotion that connected with tons of fans around the globe. His talent wasn't just about the mechanics of music, it was actually about connecting with people, making them feel his struggles and triumphs as if they were their own. Layne Staley was also known by people to be really kind and down to earth. People who knew him, both friends and bandmates, said that he was humble, quiet, really thoughtful, with a good sense of humor that even made the dark times a little brighter. Even though he was going through a lot, he still cared about other people and was really generous, often helping them out and staying close to the people that he knew. And he touched a lot of other artists, inspiring them with his realness and willingness to be open. Layne Staley's impact on music is felt today, with everyone from modern rock bands to singers just starting out claiming him as a huge inspiration. Layne Staley's memory will go down as him being one of the biggest legends rock has ever seen. Something really weird I just found out: the most expensive guitar on Amazon is a signature guitar, and you won't believe whose signature guitar it is. I left the link below in the description. And to my subscribers, I really want to thank you so much for all the inspiration and feedback. I truly do appreciate it. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe to this channel, make sure you smack that subscribe button. And while you're at it, hit the like button, join the family, and want to thank you so much for watching.